Russ Meyer's Vixen.
Russ Meyer's Beneath the Valley of the Ultra Vixens.
Chaz Kangas here for Speak Minneapolis on a fantastic occasion. As you've probably heard, legendary filmmaker Russ Meyer's filmography is finally hitting official 4K and Blu-ray, and in a lot of times for the first time, disc here in the States, thanks to the good people at Severin. And I am joined by Severin president David Gregory to talk about how this all came together. So,
Hello.
hey, well, thank you so much for being here. And to start things off, Russ Meyer being such an iconic filmmaker in terms of not just pioneering a lot of independent filmmaking, but as well as the sides of exploitation, the sides of really subversive for a lot of hot topics of the time. Do you remember the very first Russ Meyer film you ever saw?
I do. It was Faster Pussycat Kill Kill. It was a bootleg that I got from the Psychotronic store in Camden Town in London. And I was actually buying a copy of Pink Flamingos, but he happened to have double featured it with Faster Pussycat Kill Kill, and so I was just introduced to it that way. I loved it, and from then on, I wanted to know more. And it was around that time that the Incredibly Strange Film Show was airing in England, and they had the first season ended with an episode about Russ Meyer. So that was where I got my kind of crash course in Russ Meyer's filmography.
Excellent. And that's the episode that's included as one of the bonuses on the
Correct.
disc, right?
Yes. Yeah, it was a very important show in that era because there really wasn't any documentaries about these kinds of filmmakers. They did episodes on John Waters, Ray Dennis Steckler, Herschel Lewis, Ted V. Mickles, and Russ Meyer. I think Sam Raimi in the first, which is funny, Sam Raimi now being kind of one of the biggest directors of all time in Hollywood movies. But the rest of them were very much, psychotronic filmmakers. And so there wasn't that much kind of first-hand account documentaries then. So it really opened our eyes to the fact that these filmmakers were doing what they did.
Yeah. If only we would have gotten Russ Meyer's take on what a Spider-Man movie would have looked like.
Indeed. Well, I mean, the fact that he dallied with the major studios is about as close as you're going to get with Beyond the Valley of the Dolls, and we all know how great that came out. But it definitely was definitely more the studio's version of a Russ Meyer movie than his own independent fare.
Yeah. And speaking of Beyond the Valley of the Dolls and my own personal experience, I'm coming to you today from Minneapolis, which is the home of where then the biggest movie selling chain in the States for a long time, Suncoast Video or Suncoast Motion
Yeah.
Picture Company, was originally based out of. And having been there, and as a burgeoning film fan at the start of the millennium, the one and only Russ Meyer film that they had available was Beyond the Valley of the Dolls.
Yeah.
And so for me after that, I one day just had been hearing so much about Russ Meyer, and so I went into my Yellow Pages phone book and just started calling every video store that I could. And there was only one at the far edge of Minneapolis called Nicollet Village Video, and that place only had two: Faster Pussycat Kill Kill and Super Vixens.
Uh-huh.
So kind of in the same boat where you saw him and just you fall in love with it, but then as a result, for so many years, outside the rather, if it's fair to say, clandestine means of trying to obtain the films
Yeah.
officially from
Yeah.
the Russ Meyer's Trust, these have not been available outside of bootlegs for the better part of 2 decades. And you mentioned getting to see the Russ Meyer's interview, and unfortunately, with him passing on in 2004, he died just before the influx of social media and the ability to connect and see so many things from these directors. So reintroducing these films finally, and with it being, and when I first saw the note that Severin was putting it back out, like I just couldn't stop beaming. What was the story of finally being able to, as put in one of the press releases, the white whale of getting to release the Russ Meyer films?
Yeah, well, so they've always been in the control of Russ Meyer, and since he passed away, the Russ Meyer Trust, which is great in some ways because not many filmmakers get to control their own work. So while he was alive and active, he was able to control every part of the filmmaking process through distribution, which is pretty rare for an independent filmmaker, properly being independent. Um, The problem with that was when he started to deteriorate mentally, he, kind of fell out of keeping up to date on the technology. And so basically, after he died, the DVD world had actually was starting to move on to Blu-ray. And the films were never really remastered during that period. They were mastered. State-of-the-art masters from the early 80s when they were put out on VHS, and across the land, you could get these on VHS. You could buy them directly from Russ, but they'd never been remastered since then. And that was kind of the problem because the technology was such that, you need to remaster from the film elements in order to get the definition that you need to make a state-of-the-art disc. And the trust were basically looking for partners to work on this with. They didn't necessarily have the knowledge to be able to do it themselves, but they knew that there was, these films needed to be kept in distribution. So they did some DVDs and I think even Blu-rays of their own, but of a few of the films, but they were taken from those old standard definition masters that Russ had supervised and were great back in the day, but, had now become kind of ancient. Um, so it took a while for them to find a company to partner up with to do this, and they were very ad they had specifics that they wanted, such as fulfilling what Russ would have done if he was still alive. For example, we had to create the artwork based on his VHS designs that were on all the VHSs, which wasn't necessarily something some of the other boutique labels wanted to agree to prior to signing an agreement. But we fought tooth and nail to make a case for the fact that Severin was the right home for these films and that we would treat them like the great filmmaker that Russ is. This isn't just, some funny, exploitation filmmaker to us. This is a guy who was genuinely a great American filmmaker and a true American independent filmmaker at that. So it took a little while to get there, but ultimately we all landed on the same page and were able to at least do these first five titles.
And they look amazing. It's in one of the extras that shows a bit of Russ's work as a wartime photographer. So the man knew how to make something look
He
amazing.
certainly did. Yeah, he trained as a photographer, and like you say, his military service, he was a photographer as well. So he loved the camera.
And just seeing how phenomenal that these look, having like watched the first three, the Vixen trilogy, and I'm sure as someone who also grew up on the bootlegs of these, not even knowing they could look this good. Like,
Absolutely. Even the official, when Arrow did some DVDs in the UK back in the early 2000s, and again they were still taken from the old masters, and it is really a revelation when you actually see the 4K scans from the original negatives. And we were present during the entire process on Vixen. It was the Museum of Modern Art who actually did the restoration, and on Super Vixens and Beneath the Valley of the Ultra Vixens, Severin did it, using pretty much the same equipment and going to the same lengths to do this. And just beautiful to see these films, even when they were raw scans, before they were color corrected and restored. It was just amazing to see, how beautifully framed they were, how wonderfully shot, just everything in them is fantastic. And so once they started to come to life with the color correction and removing all the anomalies in the restoration, it was really quite something. They are these restorations really are beautiful.
and they sound fantastic as well. A lot of times with, as you know, and sometimes when films get re-released, especially ones that had spent so long not commercially widely available on the different changing technology, song rights issues have become a major thing. So just curious, with Russ and the Russ Trust having full control of these films, was the business all in line to have no hiccups with the
Oh,
soundtrack?
absolutely. Russ was just, first and foremost, he was a great businessman. So he made sure all his paperwork was in place when he did the movies. He didn't want to run into any of those kinds of hurdles later on down the line. And he was very prophetic in that, in the way that he saw that there would be value for these movies for years and years to come. And I think at the time that he made them, of course, he was talking about kind of second run theaters and the drive-in circuit and that sort of thing. And then maybe like getting less money as they were bicycled around the country or around the world. But, to actually make sure that that stuff was maintained for the future is pretty huge. So yeah, there was no rights issues in that respect.
Were there any unexpected hiccups with getting these new ones ready?
Well, the main hiccup was the fact that Beneath the Valley, the Ultra Vixen's negative was quite damaged. So basically, for a number of years, he kept his negatives on his property in Hollywood. They're now at the Museum of Modern Art and at the Academy here in Los Angeles. But basically that keeping them in shed is not optimal for negative materials. Thankfully, most of it's in has been retained in pretty good condition, and now they're in the exact conditions they need to be in for preserving film. But Beneath the Valley of the Ultra Vixens, for one reason or another, which was the last film that he made, was the one that actually suffered from some water damage. So we had to do a few hundred hours extra restoration on that to bring it up to speed.
I'm glad you bring up how that was his final film, let's say, final official narrative film, final
Yeah,
theatrical.
certainly shot on film. Yeah.
Right, right. So one thing that really kind of surprised me is seeing in a lot of the extras with him talking about a perceived or fourth film, The Jaws of Vixen,
Yeah.
which I'd kind of always taken as just kind of a joke at the end of Beneath the Valley of the Ultra Vixens. But it seems like he really, and unless this is part of the joke that I'm now part of, did he really try to get that fourth one made? Because so much of Beneath the Valley feels like a great final bow of his not just the series in there, but his filmography.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think he ever retired necessarily from filmmaking. I think it's just his interest on what project he was going to do next would change. And so there were several sort of announced things or things that were rumored that he was going to do next. But the one that took a lot of time in those later years while he was still lucid, shall we say, was The Breast of Russ Meyer, which was the epic documentary, autobiographical documentary he was working on for many years, which never got completed. And he basically, and it didn't not get completed because he fell ill and died. I think he lost interest in it after working on it for many years and realized that it wasn't workable as a releasable film, which is a shame because in this era with discs you can release a 10-hour movie straight to disc because it doesn't actually matter what the length is. It's like the theatrical experience would have been a problem for something that was several hours long and probably would have had to been in parts, or it would have to, as he says in the Incredibly Strange Film Show, it would have to play at a museum or something like that. It wouldn't be something that you could just bicycle around the drive-in.
Now I'm imagining a Russ Meyer take on Warhol's Chelsea Girls, where you have the two projections happening at the same
Yeah.
time. So,
Yeah, but I think it was much more, I wouldn't necessarily say linear, but that clip that you see in the Incredibly Strange Film Show, it's definitely Meyer-esque, the way that he's kind of jumping from now to then and that kind of with a narration, that sort of thing.
mhm. So getting to work with these three films, let's just take them to the original Vixen trilogy so
Yeah.
intimately, and looking at the time that they came out, between the '68 for Vixen, working on that, and on top of the very Russ Meyer hallmarks that we all talk about, there's such a deep, touch on, everything from Vietnam to racism to prejudice. And then you look at something like the end of Beneath the Valley of the Ultra Vixens, which, sends up religion, sends up suburbia. And you remember that in the context of these things, these are a film that came out just before the porno chic era. And then the other, at essentially the very end can be
Yeah.
perhaps interpreted certain ways as almost a response to it, with especially in some of the interviews, Meyer mentioning how he doesn't see his films as pornography, but more so human cartoons, which I think is the best way to
Absolutely.
describe them. So
Yeah.
now getting to work with those three films so intimately, what new has emerged, like new takes that or maybe things you hadn't noticed before about this particular trilogy?
Yeah, I mean, I always knew that Russ had something to say. He wasn't, as much as he plays the guy who's like, I just want to see big boobs on screen, as much as he sort of does that and likes to kind of bait censors and moralists and things like that. He definitely had something to say. I mean, you can see that clearly in Vixen. It's basically, he is bringing up a lot of pretty serious issues at the time, all packaged in this around this insane crazy lead character, which is embodied by Erica Gavin, and she brought an enormous amount, by his own admission, to the success of that movie, and that was by far his most successful film at that time, if not for his entire career. So yeah, seeing that, and then of course the Super Vixens and Beneath the Valley of the Ultra Vixens are now up, that we just announced yesterday. He after the studio period, he predominantly relied on this kind of cartoony way of doing things. It was very kind of Looney Tunes influence, wasn't it? There's a lot of explosions, quick cutting, funny narrations, funny noises, things like that. But like you say, there's still that kind of observation of American life. He's very much playing into the his very American obsessions and interests.
Mhm. And then with as we were recording this week's announcements of the upcoming release of Motorcycle and Up, what led to those two to be chosen for the next releases?
Well, Up was always going to be part of it. So when we were discussing with the estate, it was like, well, we should do the Vixen films out of the gate, right? And Up was actually released as Mega Vixens overseas. So that was sort of considered part of the Vixen films, because there's no actual, linear or story connection between the Vixen films. They just have Vixen in the title. So Mega Vixens was actually one of them, but most of us have only known that film as Up, so we decided to do the other three first, and then bring Up out afterwards. But we also added Motorcycle to the package, because when we were doing the DVDs extras with Arrow in 2005-ish, or 2006, I don't know. It was the early 2000s. We had already shot interviews for extras for some of them, which never got used by on the Arrow discs, and one of them was the interviews with Haji and Alex Rocco for Motorcycle, which had been sitting on the shelf for the best part of 2 decades, and we really wanted to find an opportunity to use them. So we asked for Motorcycle, coupled with the fact that it's kind of a dry run for Faster Pussycat Kill Kill, and Faster Pussycat Kill Kill was not on the table in the initial negotiations, because of course that's the big golden goose. So basically, Motorcycle, is thematically similar to his most now popular film, and we had those interviews, so that's why we added that one. We've been debating internally kind of what would be next, if we had the opportunity to do the next lot, and we've kind of whittled it down now to a top six.
Wonderful. Cool. So, when did you sort of start to notice, like having like worked on these in the early aughts as well, and which is shortly following him passing away? Did you notice a particular time that there was a critical reappreciation or reevaluation of his work?
It was around that time. I don't know that it ever got to the point that Russ would have liked it to get to, even though he always maintained he was not about being played in art houses. He was about playing for the masses. And I think that's true. He was making his movies for the masses. But the idea that he wasn't really being appreciated as the filmmaker that he is, as the independent filmmaker he is, and talked about in those kinds of, elite circles, was probably a little frustrating for him, because quite rightly it should be. And it's only because of that pornography adjacent factor that people get a bit bent out of shape or dismissive of that kind of film, in the same way they do with genre film directors, basically. But I do think after that time that I got to know about him, the Incredibly Strange Film Show, and certainly in England, people started to talk about him as a filmmaker, and whereas probably over here it was around the same time too, that when Faster Pussycat started to be something that people considered like a major work in American independent cinema, that's probably when, which is funny because it wasn't one of his successful films when it first came out, but then certainly was the one that people would refer to. That, and I guess, Beyond the Valley of the Dolls, but of the independent films, Faster Pussycat now is the one that people hold in by far the highest regard.
Yeah, it's one of those movies too where even you can't enter a college dorm without seeing that poster on a wall somewhere.
Yeah,
And those who then grew up and then became the film scholars, getting able to go back and talk about just how much deeply goes in there. So
yeah, yeah,
yeah, and that
exactly.
speaks to him always having been ahead of the curve and in the spirit of Russ Meyer, I have to make the pun and say, and ahead of the curves as well.
Yes,
So,
indeed.
yeah. Well, David Gregory, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. The Vixen Trilogy is now available from Severin, and Motorcycle and Up are available for pre-order as well.
That's correct. Yes, from severinfilms.com.
Spectacular. Thank you so much, and thank you for all you do in allowing truly the breast of film to step fully forward and be reevaluated by new eyes.
Thank you very much.